Cool. Let's go through each main point, and then we'll go through each subpoint, and then we'll ask some questions. Um, Chapter 1 deals. I would call this the prologue of the book. I know that if you have my notes, it says 1 to 2, but I put 1 to chapter 20, or chapter 1, verses 1 to 21 as the prologue. This introduces us to why they're going into Babylon in the first place, and it kind of funnels down when it talks about Daniel and his 3 companions, and then it just mentions Daniel at the end of the chapter. Chapter 2. Why is that twice? I don't know why that's twice there. Well, chapter 2 should be it should be called "Dream a Little Dream," right? That's chapter 2. This is the first dream of Nebuchadnezzar and the explanation and of that dream by Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 3 is bow to the golden image, or the chocolate bunny, if you know the reference to that, right? That is the main point, or the main outline for chapter 3. Chapter 4, again, we look at Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. This is kind of a unique chapter, because this is Nebuchadnezzar talking about his own experience, and how he became essentially an animal for a period of time. We'll talk about that later. Chapter 5 deals with the writing on the wall with Belshazzar. Belshazzar is one of the vice regents after Nebuchadnezzar's death. Okay? Chapter 6 deals with Darius. I think that this, and I put this at the center because there's kind of a change that goes on between chapters 1 to 5 and 7 to 12. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay? But Darius enters in, and we get to hear about him. Book of Daniel, chapter 7, deals with Daniel's first vision. Okay? Chapter 8 deals with his second one, from verses 1 to 27. Okay? We'll talk about that in a minute. In chapter 9, Daniel gets visited by a divine messenger by the name of Gabriel, and he gives him some information concerning the nation of Israel, and the plan that God has for them. Daniel chapter 10 deals with Daniel's second visitation, which is kind of interesting. Daniel chapter 11 deals with the time of the Gentile rulers, from verses 1 to 45. And then the last chapter deals with the end of days. Okay? Now, what's interesting about this is, I remember how I told you that chapter 6, there's a break in between. The first 4 chapters essentially, well, chapters 2 and forward, really deal with Nebuchadnezzar's revelation from God. I mean, God has given Nebuchadnezzar revelation like you wouldn't believe, and Daniel is there to interpret or explain what these things mean, right? This is very important, considering that the nation of Israel is in captivity, and Nebuchadnezzar is one of the prime supreme rulers at the time over the nation, or over the empire of Babylon. Okay? Of course, chapter 5, after King Nebuchadnezzar's testimony, he passes away. And what's interesting is that Belshazzar is not given a dream like Nebuchadnezzar, but he is given somewhat of a vision. Okay? And not just him, but everyone sees it at this particular banquet. After chapter 6 and following, no other king gets a vision. So Cyrus doesn't get one, Darius doesn't get one, No other king gets a vision. Instead, the visions are given to Daniel only, okay? Which is kind of fascinating. Okay? So we have King Nebuchadnezzar. He gets dreams and visions from God, and Daniel is there to explain them. Okay? In chapter 5, there's a vision that occurs with Belshazzar and all those who are within the banquet, and Daniel is also there to explain those. But from chapter 7 all the way to 12, Daniel gets them, and someone else explains them. Okay? Which is fascinating. All right, let's talk a little bit. Let's go ahead and enter in very quickly and talk about some of the subpoints that we see in each chapter. In chapter 1, we are introduced to 4 individuals: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That is respectively Belshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay. That is verses 3 to 7. The Daniel plan, verses 8 to 16, where Daniel comes and appeals to one of the officials of Nebuchadnezzar because he doesn't want to eat the delicacies of the king's table. And so they, switch to vegetables and water, essentially. There was a big movement about 10 years ago where this was introduced as a diet plan for Christians. We will talk about that and see if there's any merit to that. That's verses 8 to 16. Verses 17 to 21, King Nebuchadnezzar's favor with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Okay. This is an important part of the chapter, right? Because this introduces as they end up working for the king's court, okay? And why that's important, why they need to be in that position. In chapter 2 of our subpoints of Daniel, we enter into dream a little dream. So Nebuchadnezzar's anxiety about the dream is verses 1 to 3. King Nebuchadnezzar's command to his magicians and diviners to tell him of his dream. And they admit that they cannot accomplish this. There's more going on to this than just going for them going, we can't figure this out. Okay. And we'll talk about why that is. The king's rage against the divine court, and not just his magicians and diviners, but also Daniel and his companions are in danger also of being executed. Okay. Of course, Daniel and his 3 companions, they petition the Lord. That's verses 13 to 18. Daniel's praise to God concerning the revelation of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. That's verses 19 to 24. Daniel's explanation to King Nebs concerning the dream. That is verses 25 to 30. Okay. Why he knows Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Then King Nebuchadnezzar's dream is told by Daniel. He gives him specific details about what this dream is. That's verses 31 to 35. Verses 36 to 45 is the explanation and the meaning, of course. And then Daniel and his 3 companions are honored by the king due to the explanation, as well as the details of the dream laid out by Daniel himself. And that lays out the subpoint for chapter 2. I find it very fascinating, too, that Daniel is the one who interprets the dream, but yet all of them are honored at the end of the chapter. He's not the one that's just honored. All of them are, which is fascinating. Again, we'll talk about that when we get there. Chapter 3, bow to the golden image of the chocolate bunny. We enter into some of the subpoints for this. In verses 1 to 9, King Nebuchadnezzar's command to pay homage to the golden image and the consequence for refusing. He says this to everyone throughout the kingdom, right? You either bow and pay homage to this image, or you will be put into a fiery furnace. It wasn't just Daniel and his companions, it was anybody who didn't bow. Okay. We see in verses 10 to 18 the refusal of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to bow to the golden image. Verses 19 to 23 talk about the heat of King Nebuchadnezzar and the heat of the furnace, that King Nebuchadnezzar becomes extremely angry, super angry, right? And it talks about how hot this furnace got in 19 to 23. In verses 24 to 27, of course, we read that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, again, it's really interesting how Daniel is not mentioned in chapter 3. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Azariah, Hananiah, and I can't remember the other one's name. Thank you. They end up, Daniel's not mentioned here at all in chapter 3. They are it. Okay. They end up getting thrown into the furnace, and of course, we see that there was one like the Son of Man among them. And that's verses 24 to 27. And then Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are honored as a result of it. Okay. In subpoint 4, King Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. We read in verses 1 to 3, King Nebuchadnezzar's praise and admiration to God. I remember, if you remember or recall a couple of teachings ago, I mentioned that this is probably during the end of his life, before he died. He's recalling this event that occurred with him. King Nebuchadnezzar has a second dream. This is verses 4 to 18. This takes up a large chunk of the chapter. Daniel is called and explains or interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream. This is 19 to 27. In verses 28 to 33, Nebuchadnezzar's dream is fulfilled here. Okay. And then verses 34 to 37, it ends with Nebuchadnezzar's praise to God. Again, I find this fascinating that we have bookends here. It starts that way and it ends that way, right? Starts with God being praised by Nebuchadnezzar and ends with it. Right? Then we jump to chapter 5. Nebuchadnezzar has passed away. He is dead. And there is another king to come and take his place. This king here at this point of history is Nabonidus. Nabonidus has a vice regent who's known as Belshazzar, which is his son. In the subpoints here, we find Belshazzar's banquet, that's verses 1 to 4. The writing on the wall, verses 5 to 12. Daniel is summoned and he explains and interprets the writing on the wall, that is verses 13 to 28, respectively. And then we have the death of the king and the rise of another king in verses 29 to 31. Continuing on in chapter 6, enter Darius the First. From verses 1 to 28, we see some of the subpoints here that we'll be going over. We see the establishment of Darius as the vice regent of Babylon, okay, whose king is Cyrus. Okay. Cyrus takes over. He is the king of Persia, and he assigns Darius as the vice regent of Babylon. This is verses 1 to 5. The establishment of the law of Darius not to petition any other god except the God of the Persians. This is verses 6 to 9, respectively. Daniel's violation of the law. Again, I find this very fascinating that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not mentioned in this chapter either. So just like Daniel's not mentioned in chapter 3, they're not mentioned here in chapter 6. Okay? Daniel's violation of the law, and then Daniel contained and delivered from the lion's den. This is verse 16 to 22. Interesting details there in this chapter concerning this particular event and why this is a big deal. Then we see the justice of King Darius in verses 23 to 24, and then the praise of God from King Darius, the first from 25 to 28 of this text. Scaling back to Daniel chapter 7, we get a glimpse of Daniel's first vision. Okay? Looking at some subpoints there. We are introduced to four beasts and their qualities. These visions that Daniel receives are rather eclectic, very esoteric. We got these strange, odd creatures. Although how cryptic and mystic they are, I don't believe that Daniel is scratching his head, wondering about these. I think he knows what they are. And we'll talk about that when we get there. Verses 1 to 8. Verses 9 to 12, the presentation of the Ancient of Days is described there. And then we have the reign of one that looks like the Son of Man in verses 13 and 14. And then, after all of this detail, Daniel gives, or the people, or the one that comes, the messenger, gives the explanation of the vision here in verses 15 to 28. We get the details of what this means. Jumping into chapter 8, Daniel's second vision, we get a historical marker at the front of this when this vision takes place. And then we see the vision of the ram and the goat in verses 1 to 8. And then we have the vision of what is known as the little horn in verses 9 to 14. Then again, we have the explanation or the interpretation of the vision of the ram and the goat and the little horn as well, and what they all mean and why it is important. This is found in verses 15 to 27 of chapter 8. Continuing on in the subpoints, we get Daniel's visitation in chapter 9. Probably one of the most important chapters in the book of Daniel as well. 3 subpoints here, but they are huge. We'll be spending lots of time here. Daniel's prayer in verses 1 to 19. We find the opening of this chapter starts with Daniel reading the book of Jeremiah, right? And seeing how many years they have in captivity, and this motivates him to pray. And some of the details of that prayer, very fascinating. Okay? In verses 20 to 23, Gabriel appears to Daniel. Gabriel is a divine messenger sent to give Daniel a message. Right? And then we have the 77s message from Gabriel concerning the nation of Israel and the years that are put before the nation of Israel to complete essentially the plan that God has for them. Again, fascinating chapter. And we will spend tons of time there when we get there. Chapter 10, Daniel's third vision, from verses 1 to 21. Some of the subpoints are as follows. A man appears to Daniel. This is verses 1 to 9. And this man has he has a delay. The mail gets lost, and they have to go find it. That's not what happens. That's not what the delay was. There's a delay in the message and the explanation for the delay. There's a lot of talk about the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece and all of that stuff. Like I said, we'll explain that when we get there. That's verses 10 to 21. Chapter 11, the time of the Gentile rulers, is what I title it. There's 3 subpoints here. We see the rise, the messenger in chapter 11 talks about the rise of 3 rulers after Darius. Who are these 3 rulers, right? Then we see the rise of what has been deemed as the king of the north and the king of the south. This is verses 5 to 35. So there's some back and forth, lots of intrigue. This could almost be if Netflix ever wanted to produce such an epic time, this would be a cool place to do it, because there's lots of intrigue, lots of backstabbing, lots of back and forth corruption, lots of rising to power. I mean, it's really kind of fascinating. Then we have the rise of the king that will do as he pleases, and his interaction with the kings of the north and the south. Okay? And that's verses 36 to 45 at the end of chapter 11. Lastly, we have chapter 12, the end of days, and the subpoints here is the rise of Michael, the archangel, and the times of distress in verses 1 to 2. The messenger mentions these Michael and a time of great distress. In verses 5 to 8, the chapter discusses the rise of those who have insight and the shame of those who do not. We see Daniel has a question to the men who appear before him and are telling him all these things. This is verses 5 to 8. And then we have the response of the men in verses 9 and 10. And then we have something odd in verses 11 and 12. We are introduced to 2 numbers, 1290 and 335. Each of these are days. That's mentioned and described in verses 11 and 12. And then the promise to Daniel concerning the end of the age that rounds out verse 13 of chapter 12. Okay. So we've looked at all of the main outline, or all of the main titles of the outlines that I put out. We've looked at the subpoints and each of the verses represented within those subpoints. But there's some questions that I think are important throughout each chapter that when we go through the book of Daniel, I seek to answer these. These are ones that, as I'm kind of reading, I kind of mark down. Maybe perhaps you can follow along too and answer these yourself. Let's start with chapter 1. 3 questions I have for chapter 1. Why does the book begin in such a manner? In verse 1 of chapter 1, we read, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. I'm curious as well, why does it start off this way? Why is that important to know? Particularly when most of the book is about Babylon anyway. What do Daniel and his companions' names mean? That is Belshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why are they given those names? Why did they just not keep the names that they have? Why not Daniel and his companions' names? Aren't they enough? Why are their names changed? That's verse 7. Now, chapter 1, verse 7 does not tell you why their names changed. There's not an explanation given, but I believe that there is one within the text. So we will examine that when we get there, Lord willing, in a couple of weeks. The third question I have is, why was Daniel and his companions denying the food of the king a favorable thing to do? Why was that important? Was it just that they were watching their weight? Is that what it was, right? They were on the Weight Watchers plan, right? They wanted to make sure that they were healthy. Why is that an issue? So we will examine those and answer those questions from chapter 1. In chapter 2, concerning Nebuchadnezzar's dream, there's a switch in language from Hebrew to Aramaic in verse 4. Why is that switch made? That doesn't seem to make much sense given to us. I mean, that, why didn't you just write the whole thing in Hebrew and that would be cool? But it seems that there's a switch. And that, by the way, this switch in Aramaic continues all the way to the end of chapter 7. So this isn't just a small chunk of language. I mean, this is a huge switch. Why is that important? I will seek to try to give an explanation to that because I think it's important, particularly for the narrative itself. Is the switch of the language random or is it coordinated? Well, that goes to number 2. Is this, just did Daniel just decide, I think I like Aramaic. I think I'm going to write until I'm done, right? Or is it coordinated? We'll talk about that. If the switch of the language is coordinated, then why is it coordinated? That's number 3. And what are the 4 kingdoms of Nebuchadnezzar's dream? What are they? I would like to re-examine this because I have some thoughts. So we will be spending tons of time talking about that. That's verses 20 to 49. That's going to take some time because we're going to have to look at all these history and timelines. And thanks. But I'm up for the challenge, though. So we'll see. Okay. Chapter 3. First question, what is the golden image? We see that it has no name. We are not given any details of what this golden image is or why it's important. But I have a thought about this. I think I know what it is. Okay? And I will attempt to try to demonstrate that and prove that. I also think that there's a reason why it's called the golden image too. So we'll talk about that as well. Okay? Question 2, why is Daniel not mentioned among his 3 companions? Why is he not thrown within the fiery furnace? Have you ever thought about that? Well, I thought about it. And I will attempt to try to offer an explanation as to why that is. And of course, lastly, verse 25, who is the 4th man among the companions, if not Daniel? Who is among these individuals? That will round out the questions for me in chapter 3. Now, this doesn't mean that there won't be more questions along the way. These are just the ones that I thought of right now. So there could be some more coming, right? I know I had 3, but there's 2 more I need to answer. So don't just. These are prelims, all right? I reserve the right to alter the questions. Okay? Yes. Chapter 4, prologue, King Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. Just 2 for now. Why does King Nebuchadnezzar write in Daniel's book? Fascinating, right? If this book is attributed to Daniel, why is Nebuchadnezzar writing in it? And why is this historical account placed here? Why isn't it placed earlier or later? Remember, these writings are not in chronological order, right? But I believe that there's an important reason why it's placed within this part of the chapter, with this part of the book. And I will attempt to try to give an explanation for that. Okay. Skipping on to chapter 5, some questions I have. Why is that? No, that's chapter 4. Chapter 5. What are the questions here? These are on the notes, so if you don't have them, I will just go ahead and read them. Oops. Here we go. Here we go. All right. Chapter 5. Why is the banquet important? Why is it recorded here in verses 1 to 12 in chapter 5? Right? Why is this important? What's going on here? Why is this event laid out here? And then 6, why is the historical account, or 2, I'm sorry, why is the historical account recorded here in Daniel in chapter 5? Why is this placed here? Why bring up Belshazzar in the first place? Right? Again, we will answer these 2 questions as it pertains to chapter 5. Chapter 6, enter Darius 1. Some questions that I have. Who is Darius the Mede? Which means that we will have to do a deep dive into Darius the Mede. We'll have to do a small case study concerning him and his rule and his responsibilities, where he came from, things like that. We have to figure this out. We'll do the same thing with Belshazzar too. Okay, we'll try and squeeze out some information from him. What is the law of the Medes and the Persians? Is it just one law? Is it an alternate law? Remember, we talked about that the Code of Hammurabi is pretty substantial, particularly for Babylon. But is this the same as the Medes and Persians? So we will attempt to explain that. And again, why is this historical account recorded here in Daniel and chapter 6, respectively? Okay. This gives us chapter 7 and some questions I have about this. 3 questions. What are these 4 beasts and why does Daniel see them? Do these 4 beasts represent other things? Are these 4 beasts like really there? Why does Daniel see them? Why does he see them first? Why is this important? Who is the Ancient of Days? And why is this description used? What does it mean to say the Ancient of Days? This is verse 9. And again, who is one like the Son of Man? And why is this important for Daniel to know? This is verse 13. Okay. In chapter 8 of Daniel, again, I have some questions here. 3 of them. What is the vision of the ram and the goat? What does this mean? And what is the little horn? What does that mean as well? And again, why are these things important for Daniel to know? Why does he feel that they're important for us, for him to write down? So individuals reading this would be informed of this. In chapter 9, we are introduced to tons of questions. I got tons of them. Like I said, there's 10 of them, but there might be more than them depending on how deep we want to get. Why does it begin with Daniel praying to the Lord? This is verse 3. Who is Gabriel? Verse 21. So we might have to talk about him a little bit. Why is Gabriel sent? This is verses 22 to 23. Question 4. What are the 70 weeks or the 77s, really? We will examine that in verse 24. Who is your people? You know, there's a lot of individuals, as I was looking through some of these, asking these questions, looking through some commentators and things like that. There's some wild ideas of what this means. Who is your people? So we got to figure that out. Who are your people in this text? Who is the Messiah, the Prince? And who is the Prince who is to come? Are these 2 the same? We got to examine that. What does 1 week mean in this text? It talks about that there'll be 1 week, which is related to this, obviously. So what does this mean? What is the firm covenant? And who is the many? Right? So lots of questions there, and we will attempt to try to describe them in detail. Chapter 10, Daniel's third vision. Again, just we have quite a bit of questions here. What is this man that appears to Daniel? This is verse 5. It's also recorded, too, that Daniel was in mourning for 3 weeks. Why is he in mourning for 3 weeks? I mean, the guy doesn't even take a shower. He doesn't take a bath for 3 weeks. I mean, your boy's right? Why is he doing this? What is the point? What is the purpose? Who is the prince of the kingdom of Persia? Persia already has a ruler. Is this talking about a vice regent? Is this talking about a commander, a general? Is it talking about someone else or something else? It's the same thing in question 5. Who is the prince of Greece? Right? Who are these people? Right? Or these persons? Who is your people referring to in this text? That's verse 14. Again, is it talking about Israel? Is it talking about the Gentile people? Is it talking about something else? And who is Michael, your prince? Interesting. So we got a lot of prince language here, right? So we gotta clarify all this. What is happening here? And why is this important for us to know? Chapter 11, the time of the Gentile rulers. Tons of questions here. If we read through the text, you probably might have the same questions I do. For instance, who are the 3 kings who will arise in Persia that are mentioned? There's a 4th king that's mentioned past these kings who have far more riches. Well, who is that? Who is this 4th king that will arise, that will have far more riches, that will surpass all of them? And verse 3, who is this mighty king? So there's 3 kings, there's a 4th one, and then there's a mighty one. Are these 2 the same? Are these 2 different? How extensive is their rule if they are not the same? This mighty king has a kingdom that's broken up. Well, if he's such a mighty king, then why is his kingdom broken up then? And what happens after the breakup of this kingdom? Verse 5, who is the king of the south? And who is the king of the north? Question number 7, who is the king that will do as he pleases? Is it one of these? Or is it someone else? Verse 8. Question 8. How will the king of the north and the south interact with this king? Verses 37 to 45. Verse 9. What is the beautiful land? The beautiful land is actually mentioned a couple of places. It's prominent here in chapter 11, but it's also mentioned in earlier chapters as well. Okay? What is the beautiful land? And question 10, what is the royal pavilion in verse 45 and the holy mountain? What is going on there? Okay. Last chapter here, and pertinent questions. Again, we have 11 of them here and 13 verses, so almost 1 question per verse here. The first question I have is, who are those who have insight that Daniel writes about? Who are those who have insight? Is that, people have aha moments? What does it mean to have insight? Daniel, in question 2, Daniel was told to seal up the book until the end of time. Why is he told to do that? particularly if he's writing it? Why is he told? Wouldn't we want people to read this? Why is he telling people? Why is Daniel told to seal up the book? That's verse 4. What does it mean that knowledge will increase? As the book is sealed, knowledge will increase. Is it talking about knowledge will increase throughout history? Is it talking about knowledge will increase at a certain time period? What does that mean? Verse 4, what does times, and half a time mean? Now, when we did the book of Revelation, I explained this, but we will do that again, so you won't spend 45 minutes trying to find it, right? Among all of the teachings of Revelation, all 215 of them. So we will go through that. If you don't want to wait, you can kind of go through that and kind of find it. But if you do want to wait, we'll get there eventually. What does that mean? What is the 1290 days? What are those? And the 335, and why are they important? Are these symbolic numbers? Are these actual numbers? Are these actual days? What is the abomination of desolation? We should be very familiar with that. We'll just got finished talking about that in Matthew. We will go through that when we get there. After the 135 days, it says that one is blessed after these days. Why is one blessed after those days and not the 1290? That's fascinating. We will discuss that. What is the end of the age? Again, we'll just went through this with Matthew, so we will cover this as well. What is the end of the age, and when is the end of the age? Okay. And what does all of this mean anyway? Right? Now, as I said before, these are just, I believe, some of the questions. We will go through each of these questions and answer them in detail. I would invite you guys to come along with me and answer these. We may find more questions that we would like to answer, and we will address those hopefully throughout this discourse. Okay. This brings us to the conclusion in the book of Daniel, chapter 1, part 1. Next week, we will begin to go through this book in detail and answer these questions and outline and highlight the subpoints and all of that stuff. So keep this if you have it. If you need one, keep it in your Bible, because we're gonna go through all of these and hit subpoints and markers and everything else like that. So by the time we're done, Lord willing, if the rapture doesn't come, you will have a full comprehensive view, I think, of the book of Daniel by the time we're finished. Okay? All right, let's go ahead and pray, and then we will close out. Lord, thank you so much for this book. This book is short, 12 chapters, but dense with information. And it definitely underscores your glory for sure. I believe that is the underlying theme of this whole entire book, is your glory and being acknowledged as such, that you are the God of not just Israel, but the Gentiles as well. I pray, God, that again, we would continue to think about this, ponder this, just prepare ourselves, Lord, to examine this book in greater detail. Thank you so much, Lord, for just what you have given to us through Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar in their account. For it's in your Son's name. Amen.